there is a greater and greater coherence around thinking and feeling that we need to revamp the way we have structured our lives to center care in the widest sense of the word, and thriving of people and the planet as we try to rebuild in this post-COVID era.
Greetings, good people. I'm Kumi and and you're listening to Power, People and Planet, a series of candid conversations with activists and community leaders from around the world, aiming to tackle the biggest questions of our time. What's race and inequality got to do with climate change? Is our current economic and political system even capable of restoring nature or tackling inequality? And how do we start to rebuild trust, even a new social contract between citizens and people in power?
Trouble the water. Who's that young girl dressed in red? Wade in the water. Must be the children that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Who's that young girl?
Today is a historic day. It is Juneteenth, a day that celebrates the emancipation of African Americans who were enslaved. President Biden, more than a century later, has just declared Juneteenth as a federal holiday in the United States. Wade in the Water, which has just been sung by our guest for today, commemorates Harriet Tubman, who made 13 trips to the South and helped free more than 70 people. She used the song to warn slaves to get off the trail and get into the water to prevent dogs that were used by slave catchers from finding them. Today we're speaking with Aruna Rao, the co-founder, current board member, and former executive director of Gender at Work, an international feminist network dedicated to building new cultures of equality and inclusion. Aruna has over 40 years' experience of tackling institutional exclusion and discrimination and knows firsthand the long, difficult process of bringing about structural change. Her work has taken her from BRAC in Bangladesh to leading the Association for Women's Rights in Development, as well as Civicus, as well as serving on the board of the UN Democracy Fund. Aruna has published extensively. Her latest book is Gender at Work, Theory and Practice for 21st Century Organizations. Aruna is also the co-host of the Gender at Work podcast, Rethinking Feminist Transformational Strategies. Aruna, thanks so much for making time, and thanks so much for that beautiful song to kick us off on this historic day for people in the United States. Great. Now, just in the context of transparency, I just got to kick off by saying Aruna used to be my boss, right? So she was the chair of the board of Civicus when I was the Secretary General, and one of my most amazing pleasures was working with Aruna and being challenged on a daily basis to ensure that Civicus would try to be the best we could be in terms of addressing the challenge of gender equality. So, Aruna, I just want to start about these last almost two sort of COVID years, if you want. And I want to ask, how has COVID changed your understanding of the relationship between people and power? What have you learned that you didn't know 2 years ago, if anything? And given that everything that's happened in the last year, do you think that fundamental systems change has become more likely or less?
Well, first I want to say that you have been an inspiration to me for many, many years. And so I'm very grateful to be able to have this conversation with you. And you have taught me many things over the years. And we share many issues in common, and we share many perspectives in common. And I think reflecting on the last couple of years of COVID, two things stand out for me. One is that the crisis has laid bare some of the worst aspects of how we have organized our lives, how we have structured hierarchies, how we have structured the nature of jobs, how we have compensated people in differential ways, how we have exploited groups of people who bear the brunt of that care economy, whether it's working in nursing homes or it's working on the front lines as frontline emergency responders, whether it's people who are migrant laborers, who travel long distances for work on a daily basis. So I think it has really brought to the fore those bare bones of exploitation and differences, and has shown us that these hierarchies of capitalism and patriarchy that underlie our societal structures have had such a detrimental impact on peoples and communities. I think that's one thing that was made very, very clear. And the second thing that really has struck me is that in response to what we are seeing around us, there is a greater and greater coherence around thinking and feeling that we need to revamp the way we have structured our lives to center care in the widest sense of the word, and thriving of people and the planet as we try to rebuild in this post-COVID era.
So what you're saying is actually not only, as many people are now acknowledging, that the social contract between government and their citizens or leaders and the people they lead is broken, because a lot of people, from the Secretary General of the United Nations to Black Lives Matter to the ITUC and many other important movements are all saying that social contract is broken and we need to address it, this relationship. But actually the way you put it makes the point, which I think needs to be made very loudly, which is the social contract has always been broken for the constituencies that you mentioned. And I'm sure another constituency which you'll agree, which makes it very, very clear of how it's been broken, is indigenous peoples. I mean, the social contract has never worked for them, or for that matter, people who are coming out of slavery, as folks in the United States and elsewhere. So would you like to reflect on that?
One of the things that's been really, really powerful, as you know, Kumi, in the last year or so, particularly in the United States, has been the protests, on the part of Black people, who have led the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, which has, I think, for not the first time, but for this moment, has galvanized attention on systemic racism, on systemic abuse. And it's not that, there has not been thinking and work in this area for many years. There are brilliant thinkers like Angela Davis and others who've talked about, the carceral state in the United States. And there's been a lot of work in that area. But the protests on the streets has been unprecedented, in a way since almost the 70s, where you had Black Lives, you had Black Panthers, the Black Panther movement, for example, in the United States, which again spoke very clearly about systemic racism. So you have this groundswell of protests, and it's not just, African Americans in the United States who are protesting on the streets. It's every color and stripe of people who have come out and protested on the streets. And similarly, there's been the same galvanization of energy and movement and peoples around, protecting land and water resources, again, in the United States, regarding the pipeline issue where there's been so much of destruction caused to the environment by the fossil fuel industry. And in the last, previous to this administration under Trump in the United States, sort of an open, call opening up the forest lands and the Arctic to drilling and to other forms of exploration, gas and natural and oil, that it's really scared people. And so there's again been a galvanizing of effort and energy around trying to save what little there is left to save. And I just want to say that it's not just when we look at what's been happening over the last couple of years. There have been people's movements of this sort that are emerging all over the world. So, in Chile, for example, last year, young women took to the streets and just took over public spaces and, called out, had this song which said, "The violator is you, you are the rapist," calling out the state, calling out the state security and police, saying you're the rapist, and that caught fire and it just spread all over the world, so that you had women in Nepal singing the same song, in their own language, women in Paris singing the same song in their own language, so I think it is a time when there's a litany of woes, things that are broken that we all know. And people are really stepping up and saying, we've had enough. We're fed up. No more. Look at Colombia right now. The country's on fire, and it's not one issue. It's a range of different issues.
Yeah. Well, yeah, in Africa, if I can give you the example of what's happened in Nigeria, I mean, we saw the most powerful resistance to the state and to the police repression following George Floyd's death, probably 6 months afterwards, and actually you saw that in fact in Nigeria we had exactly the same situation of absolute abuse by police and other repressive agents of the state. But all of what you say leads me back to the question of, are you feeling optimistic that in fact this moment presents the biggest possibility for fundamental systems change? Do you think it's become more likely or less?
I do feel optimistic. I think one has to feel optimistic. And I feel optimistic for a number of different reasons. The first I would say is that we do not lack visions of what it could be like, what we could be building towards. And that's very important. It's very important to know that, feminists, in fact, have been building a new vision of how we should structure our economy. And feminist economists have really been at the forefront of this. And Kate Raworth, for example, has put forward a new model called the donut model of economics. And what that does essentially is to center care and well-being of people and the planet, right? And really upturned a very long-standing belief that the economy is all about growth, right? So there are feminist visions of that kind, not only in economics, but also in the whole area of women, peace, and security, that are rethinking, the underlying foundations of the notion of security and violence in a way that, speaks of violence as a continuum across from domestic violence, say, on the one hand, which, as you know, has exploded, tripled during the pandemic, to nuclear war on the other hand. There is a logic that connects all of these. And they've been able to really make that logic more clear and articulate that logic so that we can better understand how much we need to change. So there's that vision. And I think similarly in the field that I work in a lot, which is about institutions, there is a lot of work trying to change these institutions that we pour our energies into, to in fact bring these visions into reality. And we understand now more and more clearly that they're not able to do that because they were built on a different logic. And the people inside these systems are broken, and you can't really slap on top of an institution that's broken with people who are broken a new vision. You have to go back and rethink the whole thing. So I'm really inspired by those visions. And I have to say, Kumi, you have a young daughter who's the same age as my younger daughter, 29 now. And I have, another daughter who's a little older. And I think what they teach us is that they have so much energy and they have so much smarts. And,
Absolutely.
if you can't help, get out of the way because, we're moving forward. And I think that's so inspiring.
Absolutely. And now there's so many rich things you said. I want to pick on some of them a little later, but I just want to take you back a couple or more than a decade when you and I were working with Manaz Afshami from the Women's Learning Partnership from Iran. And she was doing a very important piece of work, which was pushing this whole notion of human security, right, versus national security. And part of what I think we need to do is pick up that work again, because that's what has always been missing. When we talk about security, we're not talking about water security, we're not talking about food security, we're not talking about security in the home and so on. And that brings me to the question that you've raised of care, and I want to just dig a little bit deeper there. So you were recently quoted, from a UN panel, a women panel, that care, where you said, and I quote, "Care is not just a feminist issue or a women's issue, it's an existential question for humankind." Tell me more about what that means to you and why this is important for all of us, irrespective of which sector of society we're operating in.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you say it cuts across sectors. It's not something that's specific to one area or the other. And I want to go back to some of the work that Dawn has been doing in this area, Geeta Sen and Marina Durano.
Just for folks who might not know Dawn, it's Development Alternatives for Women in a New Era, which is a feminist grouping different from most in the sense that it very much grows from the global south and it's very global south driven.
And two of the people in the Dawn Network, Geeta Sen and Marina Durano, have written about remaking social contracts. And this goes to the point really that I want to make about first principles or fundamental principles. And what they say is that that gendered power relations and other social inequalities are interwoven into power systems of all kinds, into economic power systems, into international relations, into military conflicts, into political ecology. And they play out particularly for women in terms of households and families, right? So it's like the skeleton of social structures, and it influences organizing and thinking across these different realms. So the first thing we do need to think about is to recognize those inequalities of power and fundamentally rethink them as we are, and in terms of building in relationships of power that are built more on equity and justice and not on oppression and subordination, which is what we have now. So, and that is a fundamental principle of care. And so if we rethink those principles and we then build from there, it would have impacts on whatever the field is that you're working on, Right now, for example, it's also a moment when it is 25 years since the Beijing Platform of Action, which is a very big landmark moment in women's rights and gender equality worldwide. It is the year when UN Women has galvanized, people around the world in what they call generation equality, which are events and activities that have pulled people together around, what are the commitments needed now to move gender equality forward. And when you look at that, when I look at that, I think this is good, but there's an opportunity lost here because the commitments that are being formulated don't go back to rethinking fundamental principles. They are keeping those principles in place and then demanding greater investment in work on domestic violence or provision of basic services, those kinds of things. And I think that this is the moment that we're in, going back to our original point about the crises, is not a moment of, adding A to B. It's really a moment of rethinking the whole thing. And so when I say, and this was from a UN panel where they said that, care has been traditionally associated with women. Women are the ones who care for children. Women are the ones who carry the burden of reproductive work, do the community work. And that stereotype has translated into the professions, into education, for example, right? If you look at preschool education, elementary school education, mostly you have women, right? It's a low paid job, right? If you look at sort of frontline staff, who are providing care to the elderly and sick in most countries, again, it's women. Again, it's an underpaid job, right? So we have devalued that. So we've taken that principle, applied it into our professions, and because we use money as a symbol of significance and power, we've allocated little money to those professions. So I think it really is a moment when we can't just add one vision to another vision and say everything that's been here underneath that is okay, because it's not. We need to rethink our fundamental principles of how we build. And, sometimes I think, well, that's a tough call. That's a tough ask, and can we imagine that? I mean, can we imagine, a radically different future? Can we build interconnectedness more towards purpose while also caring for people and the planet? And I think, that's really a tough call, but
I think a tougher call would be, can we not do that? Right? Because right now, the writing is on the wall. And as you and I and others have said, right, we are entering the most consequential decade in history. And what we do in the next 10 years and what kind of moral courage we can muster is going to determine what future we will have, or whether we'll have a future at all. And in that context, I just want to pick up one of the things that you have been strong about as, of course, one of the gifts, I always say, that the feminist movement gave to the world was, through Kimberly Crenshaw and others, was the power, the notion of intersectionality. And if we are brutally honest about it, even in civil society organizations, and I'm talking about the more mainstream, well-known civil society organizations, most of which for a long time were mainly led by men, intersectionality was never embraced in the way that it should have. So how do you see the moment that we're in? Because in fact, the COVID moment has, in a sense, raised the profile of nurses and essential workers, and sort of given us an opportunity, I think, to say, listen, those people saved our lives, including the people who gave us food and so on during the lockdowns. Now let's do right by them. So I just want to get your sense about whether how do you see the interconnectedness of the global challenges that we're facing, and whether by forging aggressive intersectionality is perhaps one of the key success factors moving forward.
I think you're raising a very important point, and the concept of intersectionality applies to the way in which we analyze power relations and how they determine options and how they, determine barriers to people's voice or participation or influence. And I think intersectionality also is very relevant right now, as you pointed out, to the multiple issues that are facing us. So, in terms of the multiple issues that are facing us, what worries me a lot is that we're still we're dealing with them in a very siloed approach. We separate out, for example, a colleague of mine, Joanne Sandler, and I were asked to write a think paper for the OECD DAC, the GenderNet, on where do we go next? What are the strategies for gender equality moving forward? And one of the things that we pointed out in that think piece was that you have governments and NGOs and others who on the one hand talk about gender equality and human rights, and on the other hand, particularly governments, are supporting the manufacture and sale, for example, of small arms. So these two things sit side by side, and so I put to you, how can you talk about nutrition, child nutrition, and it is an extreme example, but still, child nutrition in the context of Yemen, if you don't also talk about the larger economic and geopolitical forces that are playing in that region? They are connected, and we have to call them out. It's no longer possible to sit and say, yes, let's have gender equality on the one hand, while you're pursuing policies that are really inimical to equity and justice on the other hand. So in that sense, I think, again, it goes back to fundamental principles. In terms of, what Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about and the way in which I think we understand intersectionality in terms of power dynamics. First of all, of course, over the last 20 years, we've both been educated a lot about the gender binary. We understand a lot more about gender as a continuum. And I think that's really important, as well as, when Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, my colleague, Kalyani Sengupta pointed out that, it's not just a question of categories that kind of overlap. Those categories that overlap in terms of, say, woman, Dalit, low, poor economic class, that is a social construction. It is a construction of inequality. And because it is a construction of inequality, it can be changed. It's not just that, analytical categories, wow, they overlap, let's gather data on both of them. No, that's not it, really.
It's not as if it just happened. It is people and people in power that sort of kind of created that. In fact, when I was leading the adult literacy movement in South Africa in the early 90s, I used to always, as an adult education activist, used to always do this presentation where I would draw a circle and say, if these are the people who are not literate, and then we draw a circle and say, who are the people who are homeless, who are the people who are unemployed, who are the people who are, suffering other degrees of exclusion, and you find that actually the circles are very overlapping, right? And so, but to think about how we push a progressive, to get people to understand the need for big change, right? And the difficulty is we also operating in a situation today that the repressive state apparatus is a big problem in itself in terms of army, police, use of formal laws and all that. And on the other side, I would argue in a place like the United States and most places in the world today, a bigger challenge is not the repressive state apparatus, but the ideological state apparatus. That's why Trump got arrested. That's wishful thinking. Why Trump got elected. So what would you say to a Trump, Le Pen or Bolsonaro voter to convince them of the need for change? How should progressives reach out to those outside of the people that are already, like young people already are there, right? But I'm really wanting to go back to a phrase that you used, right, where you said, to infuse our new visions of economy and society into the cracks. It's no longer possible to do that, to infuse into the cracks of broken institutions filled with broken people. Because if I understand what you're saying there correctly, I want to make a confession here and say that I am one of those broken people in a way, right? In the sense that I went into institutions approached by folks saying we know we need to change, we need to balance the power between North and South and so on. And in the end, felt pretty broken in terms of what is achieved. But so I'd like to look at those who are seemingly on the right side of history now. And I know that you have been doing some thinking around the shortcomings of quote unquote progressive organizations or organizations on paper who say they're doing all the right things, but are really, really struggling, right? And I don't think it's that people willfully don't want to change, right? But maybe you can tell me where you stand on that. But I just think that the structures and so on that have been put in place have actually made it difficult for people to actually rise. But I'd love to hear you go deeper into the broken institutions and the broken people, which in some ways I think we all are.
Yeah. It's a tough one, isn't it? When I started, co-founded Gender at Work with David Kelleher in 2001 as a civicus. It was a civicus project until we registered. My belief was that we, by working in strategic ways with people on the inside of organizations of different kinds, whether it was community-based organizations or trade unions or national government programs or international NGOs or UN multilateral organizations, that if we worked together in strategic ways, we could really shift around power dynamics in a way that would enable a different kind of voice to be spotlighted and different strategic decisions around resource allocation, etc., to be made towards justice and equity, to change the cultures within these organizations from, sort of cultures of that really promulgated fear and were held in place by authorities and hierarchies. And particularly for women and other kinds of, non-conforming, genders, if you will, the threat of violence and sexual harassment, right? And we worked, for almost 20 years now with these range of institutions. And I've come to the conclusion that of course change happens, that because each one of us are sparks of energy and we can make things happen, within certain environments. But it's very hard to sustain that over a period of time because there's the larger environment hasn't really changed, and so there's kind of a default back to what was considered normal and default back to patriarchy. One of the things that's been happening now, which I'm sure you know, is that a series of international women's rights organizations have basically imploded, starting from the International Women's Health Coalition, Women Deliver, the Nobel Women's Initiative, well, of course, Amnesty Canada and also Amnesty International have had, real shakeups about the toxicity of the culture, the racism within the organizations. There was recently a staff survey done of the United Nations, and 1/3 of the people said they feel that it is a racist environment. They have experienced racism, and so what I feel now is that we cannot keep on sort of trying to beat our heads against a wall with these kinds of organizations, trying to shift them. We really, again, there need to go back and say, how do we construct organizations in a different way that can actually build these kinds of principles of caring and connectedness into the way in which we relate to each other, the way in which we understand work, and the way in which we understand success and accountability. Now, that's a tough call for any organization, but it's a really tough call when the environment around you is not shifting. And I see that happening again with many feminist organizations who take on these principles, from the beginning. But as they are in structures where funding is competitive, where demands on that funding generated by donors are vast, even in times of COVID, when people have been grieving because they've lost family members, the pace to produce, and produce results hasn't necessarily slowed. And it's interesting, I was talking to a young Mexican feminist who said, in Mexico, we have laws that allow you to take grievance time for, when there's been a loss in the family. But that's not the case in the United States. And so those US-based organizations who are funding these organizations in Latin America and Central America, they haven't stopped, that speed of demand. But in Latin America, we have, because we have these labor laws that are something that we can fall back on that allows us that space. So it's a big question, right? So it's not just the organization, it's this, and you know this very well, the political economy of international NGOs and donor governments, and how their priorities are framed and how they drive the work within these organizations. It's not that all these international organizations don't do good work. Of course they do. But there is a structure, an accountability system, and a hierarchy and a patriarchy and a colonial legacy that they have difficulty overcoming. And so, so those seep in, whether, no matter how feminist they want to be or how much they want to anti-racist they want to be, they really seep into, it's not a question of changing one thing over there and saying, okay, that's it, we've done it, let's move on. It really does require new thinking.
I'm gonna put you on the spot here, right? Because this is a dilemma that's very real right now. Because yes, we can say the range of institutions that have done good work or have sought to do good work, okay? But if we look at the state of the world right now, we cannot ignore the fact that we have dismally failed to advance as much as we would like to on gender equality, environmental protection, on climate action, and so on. And I remember when I was at Greenpeace, when I first started and I was on a listening exercise, most of the very few voices that existed within the global south, within Greenpeace, people were saying we need to press the reset button. We need to start again, right? Because what we are doing is we are continually making interventions one layer up over the layer just to fix a problem. But actually, we've now become so chaotic in our structure. And my reflection on amnesty would be that, what good amnesty did was, despite the structure and culture and governance of the organization, it was creative, good people who found ways to work around the difficulties of the environment. And I'm sad to say that even a couple months ago, the Amnesty Board brought out a report as well, which also found that there was a deep culture of systemic white privilege and racism within Amnesty, right? So it's not just the UN. So now, while it might not come as a surprise to you and me, it will come to a surprise to many people, right? And so the question is, should we continue to try and build institutions that started in the North and have not been able to become truly global, or should we actually say to them, listen, make space for something else to emerge? It's a difficult question, and I know, I'll take some criticism for even asking it, but these are the kinds of questions we've got to ask right now.
I really feel that system is broken. Now, and I think for all of the reasons we've just talked about, I think that because something is from the global south does not in any way give it a pass, that it also will not be broken. So it's not a question, we are as colonial and patriarchal and hierarchical and discriminatory and violent in the South, in India, in South Africa, in everywhere, as others are that we point our fingers to. So I think it's not so much. Number one, those international organizations that have been built, through these colonial legacies, I think they have really shifted. If you think back to the 1980s, around the 1980s, and you think about Oxfam UK and the kinds of things they supported in Central America and Latin America, they were extremely progressive. It was a different era. And then you had the era of structural adjustment. You had the new economic paradigms, neoliberal eeconomic paradigms, the move away from basic services, the move towards privatization of services. You had a whole shift in a global economic and political landscape that then also took these organizations along with them, and I think that so those organizations have now absorbed those values because that's the environment, that's the hand that feeds them. So that no longer works. And to be frank, as you said, it hasn't worked for very marginalized, poor communities who have organized themselves in countries around the world, separate from this international arena, right? Whom we are now turning to. We're turning now to indigenous wisdom, to
long overdue,
to fill our souls again with hope and energy, and so I think, it has come back to that. And when you talk to people who talk about energetic systems and spiral dynamics and the energetic architecture in the world, they will tell you that we have so far veered away from the feminine center, that we're paying the price for that, and we need to go back and find that. So, and indigenous wisdom also, is very much related to that. So I would say that we need to collectively rethink these principles and figure out how we organize in a different way. And it applies to us in the South as much as it applies to, those in the North.
Sure.
we're not immune.
I'm glad you made the point. And also, if you look at many of the cultures of civil society in the global South, they have been heavily influenced by that very donor reality, the so-called partner. I push back against this use of partners where international NGOs talk about the people they interact with or fund and so on. And it's fundamentally an unequal partnership. But the thing is, there's what's the point of many of us in Africa being log framed? We all learned how to do log frame because some European funding institution said we needed to do our plans in a logical framework approach. And the bottom line is it's just one planning tool. But we were told you don't get money if you don't learn how to do it and you present. So when I think about my own sort of journey, I see, the weaknesses of some of the choices I've made, some of the, the ways I responded to some of these interventions that happened in our local spaces. I want to take you to something that has now become something that I got really worried about, which is this use of this words, build back better, right? When the first time I heard it, I thought, oh, that sounds okay. We need to build back better after COVID. But then once everybody starts saying it, right, I then say, this is just going to be a nice language without substance. What does build back better mean for you? And specifically, I'd like you to reflect on this question. If you were asked to design a specific clause, right, in a new sort of social contract which governments around the world would adopt, what would be that clause? Okay, so but before you get to the clause, let's get your sense of how do you feel about Build Back Better?
To me, a good example of Build Back Better is defund the police. That movement in the United States, which people were very critical about. This was Black Lives Matter, pushed that idea, and in many cities that's become a rallying point to defund the police. And people have said, well, you can't really defund the police. But in fact, if you don't take your mind to that place of defunding the police, because the police has been structured in a certain way and operate in a certain way and have a certain mindset and have these standard operating procedures, which are very, very racist and detrimental, then you don't even give yourself the chance to think and imagine something different, So that's the kind of thing which I think has been really powerful, defund the police. There have been calls for, eliminating, getting rid of this multilateral governance system that we have, which have inherited post-World War II, which sucks up a lot of resources, essentially, is essentially a tool of, 5 very powerful nations. And, Build Back Better in that context does not mean, adding South Africa and India to the Security Council. Build Back Better means getting rid of that whole institution, because it's not serving us. It's not serving us. And so that's what it means to me. It means, as we discussed, when we started this conversation, it means going back to fundamental principles. You have to think, we have to look at the interconnection between issues and the power dynamics that structure them, the inequalities that they maintain, and rethink that. And that's, as I said before, that's a big call. To me, that's what it means, to rethink that. And I think a lot of people are doing that. On the one hand, there is incredible frustration with what we have now. The other part of that is there are a lot of young people who are very disillusioned with what they're facing. We've basically ruined their future. And they're looking at us and saying, where do we turn? I mean, what do we do? Mental health crises in the United States, as in other places, are rising. Mental health issues among young people are exploding. When I look at my daughter's cohorts, the number of people who talk about mental health and who have mental health problems has just, it's exploded, and this is not because, this is not a freak. This is because when you and I were growing up, we had hope. We had an environment where we thought we can make things better, and the environment supported us. We came out of, our parents came out of, for me, out of national movements, that changed societies you were part of, and you came out of a freedom movement and a freedom struggle. There was a lot of hope in that generation, and that hope isn't there now. And so...
And the climate reality is the one that I think is really justifiably, in a way, freaking out young people and unfortunately not freaking out over people in power.
I know. If you look at the G7 meeting, and you think, what the commitments around climate change,
ridiculous.
It's like so far lower than what we need, and that's really worrisome. So to me, that's not building back better. That's just, maintaining the status quo.
But what's your clause? If you were given some magical power to say, okay, every country is going to have a social contract, and there'll be also a sort of global social contract somehow. And if you could draft one clause, what would it be? And while you're thinking about that, my last question is going to be, what's inspiring you right now and what gives you hope?
I think my major concern right now is the protection of natural ecosystems, and the valuing of social reproduction around the world. I think those are the two that that I would really focus on. And what inspires me, or what makes me move forward, I think is I don't think there's a choice. I think we have to be there to support this newer generation of leaders who are moving forward, and get out of the way if we're in the way, but be there to support them and nurture them, and share the connection. When we connect as people, and we connect to these people, these young people, it's heartwarming. It fills you with life, and it fills you with joy, and it fills you with love, and that's what it's about. And talking to you is wonderful. It's so nice to have this time together, and so I think that's what it is for me.
Thanks, Aruna, and I'm in the same space. I am very much being inspired. The main inspiration is coming from engagement with young people, mainly because their lenses are not as contaminated as ours. They have a capability to imagine different things because they've not lived in broken institutions for a long period of time and all of that. And yeah, let's hope that people of our generation can make more and more space for voices of innovation, courage, and so on. And let's be clear, our generation stands accused of failing to deliver, and And by the way, much as young people inspire me, they also, as we say in South Africa, they're also cucking on me, because they're saying, why? Why did you go there? Why did you do this? Why, and these are questions that I think are important to answer. So Aruna, thank you so much for bringing music to this podcast and reminding us and whoever's listening that part of the solution to unlocking our capability to generate the kind of momentum bottom up in large enough numbers to get our leaders to act fast enough is by respecting culture. And thank you for ending with allowing us to end with this beautiful song, How Could Anyone Ever Tell You? Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi.
How could anyone ever tell you that you're anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you that you're less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Power, People and Planet. The show is produced in association with the Green Economy Coalition, one of the world's biggest global alliances fighting for green and fair economies. We would love your help to spread the message of this podcast and the conversations within, so please do follow us and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.